The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Morrison Manor as Margaret Morrison stood at the head of the mahogany dining table, her weathered hands gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles had turned white. At 78, she had seen enough family gatherings to know when one was about to explode into chaos. Tonight felt different, though. Tonight felt like the end of something. Her 3 children sat around the table, each one a testament to how differently life could shape people from the same soil. David, her eldest at 52, sat rigid in his expensive suit, his jaw clenched as he stared at the legal documents spread before him. He had always been the responsible one, the one who followed rules and expected others to do the same. His wife Susan sat beside him, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming nervously against her wine glass, clearly wishing she was anywhere else. Across from David sat his younger brother Thomas, 48, and everything David was not. Where David wore a suit, Thomas had rolled up the sleeves of his faded denim shirt. Where David's hair was perfectly styled, Thomas's dark curls fell carelessly across his forehead. He leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who had never quite fit into this formal dining room and had long ago stopped trying. At the far end of the table sat Sarah, the youngest at 45, and perhaps the most complicated of Margaret's children. She had inherited her mother's sharp intelligence and her father's stubborn streak. But unlike her brothers, she had never quite figured out where she belonged in the Morrison legacy. She worked as a social worker in the city, choosing to help strangers rather than involve herself in the family's considerable wealth and influence. Margaret cleared her throat, and the soft conversations died away. The only sound was the rain against the windows and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock that had stood in the corner for 3 generations. "I suppose you're all wondering why I asked you here tonight," Margaret began, her voice still strong despite her age. "It's about the will." David straightened even further. If that was possible. He had been expecting this conversation for years, had probably even prepared for it. As the eldest son and the one who had taken over the family's real estate business, he naturally assumed he would inherit the bulk of the estate. "Mother," David said carefully, "perhaps we should discuss this privately, or with the lawyers present." Margaret's eyes flashed with something that might have been amusement. "I've spent 78 years on this earth, David. I think I can manage a conversation with my own children without legal supervision." Thomas chuckled, earning a sharp look from his brother. The tension between the 2 men had been building for decades, rooted in childhood competitions and fundamental disagreements about how to live life. David had always resented Thomas's freedom, his ability to walk away from family obligations without consequence. Thomas, for his part, had never understood his brother's need for control and approval. "The truth is," Margaret continued, "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. About legacy. About what really matters. Your father built this business from nothing, and I've watched it grow into something he never could have imagined. But I've also watched what it's done to this family." She looked at each of her children in turn. Sarah was studying her hands, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Thomas was watching his mother with genuine curiosity, while David's expression had shifted from expectation to concern. "David, you've given your life to Morrison Properties. You've sacrificed time with your own children, strained your marriage, and worked yourself into an early grave, all in the name of duty and family responsibility." Susan shifted uncomfortably, and Margaret caught the movement. She had always liked her daughter-in-law, but she had also seen how the pressure of being married to the Morrison heir had affected her over the years. "Thomas, you've spent your life running from anything that looked like responsibility. You've traveled the world, started a dozen different ventures, and never committed to anything long enough to see it through. You have incredible talent, but you've wasted most of it." Thomas's casual smile faltered slightly, but he didn't argue. He had heard similar assessments before. "And Sarah," Margaret's voice softened as she looked at her daughter, "you've chosen to live your life as if this family doesn't exist. You've built walls around yourself and convinced yourself that wanting nothing from us makes you somehow pure." Sarah finally looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mother, please don't. Let me finish," Margaret said gently. "I'm not criticizing any of you. I'm simply stating facts. Each of you has dealt with being a Morrison in your own way, and each of you has paid a price for it. She reached into her purse and pulled out a sealed envelope. This contains my decision about the inheritance. But before I share it, I want to tell you about something that happened 47 years ago. Margaret moved to the window, looking out at the gardens that had been her sanctuary for so many years. Your father had just secured the contract for the Riverside development. It was the deal that would establish Morrison Properties as a major player in the city. We were young, ambitious, and absolutely certain that success would solve all our problems. She turned back to face her children. That same week, I discovered I was pregnant with you, Sarah. It should have been the happiest time of our lives, but your father was so consumed with work, so focused on building something lasting for our family, that he almost missed the birth of his own daughter. Sarah's breath caught. She had never heard this story before. I remember standing in the hospital, holding you in my arms, and realizing that your father was at the office. He was building our future, but he was missing our present. And I made a promise to myself that night that I would never let this family lose sight of what really mattered. Margaret returned to her place at the head of the table. I failed at that promise. I watched David kill himself trying to live up to his father's example. I watched Thomas run away from anything that reminded him of the pressure he felt here. And I watched Sarah convince herself that she had to choose between being a good person and being a Morrison. The room was completely silent now. Even the rain seemed to have quieted. So I've made a decision that may surprise all of you. Margaret continued. The business, the properties, the investments, none of it goes to any single person. David's face went pale. Mother, what are you saying? I'm saying that I'm giving each of you exactly what you need, not what you expect. Margaret's voice was steady, but her children could hear the emotion beneath it. David, you get the satisfaction of knowing that your years of dedication haven't been for nothing. But you also get the freedom from the crushing responsibility you've carried alone for so long. This panel, she looked at Thomas. Thomas, you get the chance to finally commit to something meaningful, to prove that your talents can be used for more than just your own entertainment. Finally, she turned to Sarah. And Sarah, you get the opportunity to make a real difference, not just in the lives of strangers, but in the lives of the people who love you most. Margaret picked up the envelope and held it in front of her. Inside this envelope is the deed to establish the Morrison Family Foundation. Equal control to all three of you, the entire estate, the business, the properties, everything goes into a trust managed by the foundation. You'll all have comfortable livings, but the real work begins now. David was the first to find his voice. A foundation? Mother, you can't be serious. The business needs leadership, direction, someone who understands. Someone who understands what, David? Thomas interrupted, his casual demeanor gone. How to work 18-hour days. How to miss your children's birthdays. How to turn everything into a transaction. At least I stayed, David shot back. At least I didn't run away the moment things got difficult. Boys, Sarah said quietly, but with enough authority to stop the argument before it escalated. Let her finish. Margaret nodded gratefully at her daughter. The foundation will focus on affordable housing development and community support services. David, your business expertise will be invaluable in ensuring that our developments are profitable and sustainable. Thomas, your creative vision and international experience will help us think beyond traditional approaches. And Sarah, your understanding of what communities really need will keep us grounded in our mission. She opened the envelope and pulled out several documents. You'll have 6 months to work together on your first project. If you can't find a way to collaborate, if you can't put aside your old grievances and learn to value what each of you brings to the table, then the entire estate goes to charity. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret could see each of her children processing not just the financial implications, but the emotional ones. She was essentially asking them to rebuild their relationships from the ground up. Susan was the first to speak. Mrs. Morrison, this is very generous, but are you sure? David has devoted his entire career to this business. And now he has the chance to devote his talents to something even more meaningful, Margaret replied. Something that builds communities, instead of just buildings. Thomas ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Margaret remembered from his childhood when he was trying to work through a difficult problem. What kind of timeline are we talking about for this first project? 6 months to identify a community need, develop a plan, secure funding, and begin implementation. You'll have access to all the current business assets, but you'll need to work together to access them. David was staring at the documents as if they might change if he looked at them hard enough. And if we succeed? What then? Then you continue the work. Together. As a family. Margaret sat back down, suddenly looking every one of her 78 years. I know this isn't what any of you expected. I know it's not easy. But I've spent too many years watching this family drift apart in the name of success and independence. Sarah reached across the table and took one of the documents. As she read, her expression shifted from confusion to something that might have been hope. This could actually work, she said quietly. There's a neighborhood in East Oakland where I've been working. The community has been trying to organize affordable housing for families, but they haven't been able to access the kind of resources they need. Thomas leaned forward, interested despite himself. What kind of resources? Land acquisition, construction expertise, navigation of city bureaucracy. The things that Morrison Properties has been doing for 50 years, just for different clients with different goals. David looked up from the documents. The profit margins would be completely different. The timeline, the regulations, the community approval process. It's not the same kind of development at all. No, Sarah agreed. It's harder, it's messier, it's more important. For a moment, Margaret saw something she hadn't seen in years. Her 3 children actually talking to each other, instead of around each other. I need to think about this, David said finally. This changes everything. Everything was already changing. David, Margaret said gently, I'm 78 years old. Did you really think you could keep running the business the same way forever? Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked gardens. 6 months, he said thoughtfully. It's not much time to figure out how to work together when we've spent decades perfecting the art of staying apart. Maybe that's exactly why it needs to be 6 months, Sarah said. Long enough to actually accomplish something. Short enough that we can't spend the whole time arguing about methodology. Margaret watched her children with a mixture of hope and anxiety. She had made the only decision that felt right, but she knew she was asking them to do something incredibly difficult. She was asking them to trust each other in ways they never had before. There's one more thing, she said, and 3 heads turned toward her. I've already put this plan in motion. The foundation is established, the transfers are complete. This isn't a proposal, it's reality. Starting tomorrow morning, the 3 of you own nothing individually and everything collectively. The implications of this hit David first. Mother, you can't have done this without our consent. There are legal procedures, tax implications, all handled, Margaret said calmly. I've had very good lawyers for a very long time. Thomas laughed suddenly, a sound that was equal parts admiration and disbelief. She outmaneuvered all of us. Complete tactical superiority. This isn't a game, Thomas, David snapped. Isn't it? Thomas turned back to face his brother. Mother just checkmated all of us. She's forced us to either work together or lose everything. It's brilliant. Sarah was still reading through the documents, and Margaret could see her social worker instincts taking over as she began to understand the full scope of what her mother had done. The community impact potential here is enormous. If we can create a sustainable model for affordable housing development, it could be replicated in other cities. If we can work together, David emphasized. If we can overcome 40 years of family dysfunction and somehow become an effective team in 6 months. Margaret stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the evening and the weight of her years. I have faith in all of you. More faith than you have in each other, apparently. She moved toward the door, then paused. Your father used to say that the measure of a person wasn't what they could accomplish alone, but what they could inspire others to accomplish together. I think it's time the Morrison family learned that lesson. After she left, the three siblings sat in silence for several minutes. The rain had stopped, and the only sound was the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. Finally, Thomas spoke. "So, anyone want to grab a drink and figure out how to save the family fortune?" David looked at his brother with exasperation. "This isn't funny, Thomas. Do you have any idea what kind of pressure this puts on all of us? The business relationships I'll have to renegotiate. The staff transitions. The project commitments." "David," Sarah interrupted gently. "What if this is exactly what you need?" "What do you mean?" Sarah looked at her oldest brother, seeing for the first time not the intimidating family patriarch, but a man who had carried an enormous burden for a very long time. "When's the last time you took a vacation? When's the last time you went to one of your kids' school events? When's the last time you and Susan had a conversation about something other than business or family obligations?" David started to answer, then stopped. Susan reached over and took his hand, and Margaret's sharp eyes hadn't missed the gesture of support. "Maybe," Sarah continued, "this foundation could be a chance for you to do work that matters without having to do it alone." Thomas sat back down at the table. "I have to admit, I'm intrigued. I've spent the last 20 years avoiding anything that looked like family responsibility. But this is different. This isn't about maintaining tradition or living up to expectations. This is about creating something new." David looked back and forth between his siblings, seeing them perhaps more clearly than he had in years. Thomas, for all his apparent carelessness, had an artist's eye for possibility and a traveler's understanding of how other people lived. Sarah had spent her career working with communities, understanding their needs and navigating complex social dynamics. "The East Oakland project," Sarah mentioned, David said slowly. "What would something like that actually require?" Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. "I know the community organizer. Her name is Maria Santos. She's been trying to coordinate housing development for working families, teachers, firefighters, nurses, people with stable jobs who still can't afford to live anywhere near where they work." "What's the timeline they're working with?" Thomas asked. "They've been planning for 2 years, but they're stuck on the same things that always stop these projects: land acquisition costs, construction financing, regulatory approval processes." David's business mind was already working through the logistics. "Morrison Properties has relationships with most of the major players in the city planning office. We have standing credit arrangements with 3 different banks. We have contractors who could handle residential development. We also have something most affordable housing projects don't have," Thomas added. "We have the luxury of thinking long-term instead of just chasing quarterly profits." Sarah looked at both her brothers with something approaching optimism. "So we're actually considering this?" "I don't see that we have a choice," David said. "But honestly, I'm starting to think that might not be a bad thing." Thomas grinned. "Look at that." David Morrison just admitted that not being in complete control might not be the end of the world. "Don't push it," David warned, but for the first time all evening, he almost smiled. As the 3 siblings continued talking, working through the practical details and emotional complexities of their mother's challenge, none of them noticed Margaret standing in the doorway to the kitchen, listening to her children really talk to each other for the first time in decades. She had made the right choice. Now she could only hope they would too. 3 weeks had passed since the night that changed everything for the Morrison family, and the conference room at Morrison Properties buzzed with an energy that was equal parts excitement and barely controlled chaos. Charts covered every wall, laptops were scattered across the long table, and coffee cups in various stages of emptiness created a landscape of caffeinated determination. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by community surveys and demographic reports, her usually neat appearance abandoned in favor of comfort and efficiency. She had taken a leave of absence from her social work position to dedicate herself fully to the foundation project, a decision that had surprised everyone, including herself. Thomas paced near the windows, gesturing animatedly as he spoke into his phone, negotiating with someone in Spanish about sustainable building materials. His travels through Latin America had taught him about innovative construction techniques that could significantly reduce costs while maintaining quality. and he was determined to incorporate these methods into their project. David stood at the head of the table, but for the first time in his professional life, he wasn't entirely in charge. The dynamic between the three siblings had evolved into something none of them had anticipated. Instead of one leader and two followers, they had become a team with complementary strengths. Maria Santos just confirmed the community meeting for tomorrow night, Sarah announced, looking up from her phone. 43 families are already committed to attending, and she thinks we might see upward of 60 people. Are we ready for that many questions? David asked, his natural inclination toward thorough preparation kicking in. Thomas ended his call and turned back to the room. Define ready. We have a solid preliminary plan. We have initial financing commitments. And we have actual community input. That's more than most developers start with. But we don't have final city approval. We don't have construction contracts, and we haven't solved the infrastructure issues with the water main. David countered. Sarah stood up, stretching muscles that had been cramped from sitting on the floor. David, we're not trying to present a finished project tomorrow night. We're trying to present a partnership opportunity. Over the past 3 weeks, this had been the ongoing tension between the siblings. David's business instincts demanded complete information and guaranteed outcomes before making commitments. Sarah's community organizing experience had taught her that authentic partnerships required vulnerability and shared risk-taking. Thomas fell somewhere in between, comfortable with uncertainty but impatient with excessive deliberation. Walk me through tomorrow night one more time, David said, settling into his chair with a legal pad. Sarah moved to the whiteboard where they had mapped out their presentation plan. We start with introductions. Not just our names, but why we're doing this. People need to understand that this isn't charity, and it's not a business transaction. It's a collaboration. Thomas sat on the edge of the table. Then we present the preliminary designs. I've incorporated the feedback from the 3 community input sessions we've had so far. 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom units, community gathering space, shared garden areas, and parking that doesn't dominate the visual landscape. Financing comes next, David added, referring to his notes. The foundation covers land acquisition and infrastructure development. Families purchase their units through a shared equity program that keeps housing costs reasonable, even if property values increase. Sarah nodded. And maintenance and community management are handled through a resident cooperative structure. People have ownership and decision-making power, not just rental agreements. It sounded good when they laid it out step by step. But each of them knew that tomorrow night would test whether their plans could survive contact with the real concerns of real families. There's something else we need to discuss, Sarah said, her tone shifting to something more serious. Maria mentioned that there's been some community skepticism about our involvement. David looked up from his notes. What kind of skepticism? The legitimate kind, Sarah said. We're wealthy white developers coming into a predominantly Latino neighborhood, proposing to solve their housing problems. Some people are wondering what our real motivations are. Thomas stopped swinging his legs and gave his sister his full attention. What did you tell Maria? The truth. That we're still figuring out our motivations ourselves. That we don't have all the answers, and we don't pretend to understand community needs better than the community does. David felt his stomach tighten. In business negotiations, uncertainty was weakness. But Sarah was suggesting that acknowledging uncertainty might actually be a strength in this context. How do we handle questions about gentrification? David asked. Because that's going to come up. Sarah had been thinking about this question for weeks. We address it directly. We acknowledge that development can lead to displacement, and we explain specifically how our shared equity model is designed to prevent that. But we also admit that we can't guarantee outcomes. And we commit to ongoing monitoring and adjustment. Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city street below. You know what's strange? In all my travels, I've seen dozens of communities dealing with housing challenges, but I've never actually been involved in trying to solve them. I've just been a tourist, observing other people's problems. Sarah and David exchanged a look. Over the past few weeks, they had all been discovering things about themselves that they hadn't expected. I keep thinking about what Mother said, David admitted. about missing our present while building our future. I realized that I don't actually know what most of our employees' lives are like outside of work. I don't know if they can afford to live in the buildings we develop. That's not entirely your fault, Sarah said gently. The business world doesn't exactly encourage that kind of personal connection. Maybe it should, David said. Maybe that's what we're really trying to change. The conference room door opened, and Susan Morrison entered carrying a tray of sandwiches and a fresh pot of coffee. Over the past 3 weeks, she had become an unofficial fourth member of the team, contributing her background in nonprofit board management and her talent for diplomatic communication. "How's the preparation going?" she asked, setting down the tray. "We're as ready as we can be," Thomas said, which is either perfectly adequate or completely insufficient, depending on your perspective. Susan poured coffee for each of them. "I've been thinking about tomorrow night too. About what it means to ask people to trust us with something as important as their housing." She sat down next to her husband, and David noticed that she looked more energetic than she had in months. The foundation project had given her a way to be involved in David's work without simply being the wife of the boss. "Trust has to be earned," Susan continued. "And it has to be earned through actions, not just words. So maybe tomorrow night isn't about convincing anyone of anything. Maybe it's about beginning a relationship." Sarah smiled. "Susan, you should definitely come with us tomorrow night." "Are you sure? I don't want to overwhelm people with too many Morrisons." "You're not just another Morrison," Thomas said. "You're someone with actual nonprofit experience who can speak to the administrative and governance challenges of resident-controlled housing cooperatives." David looked at his wife with gratitude. Over the years, Susan had sacrificed many of her own professional ambitions to support his career. The foundation project was giving both of them a chance to build something together. "There's one more thing," Sarah said, pulling out a folder she had been keeping separate from the other materials. "I've been documenting everything we're doing. Every meeting, every decision point, every challenge we encounter." "For what purpose?" David asked. "Because if this works, other families and other communities might want to replicate it. And if it doesn't work, at least we'll have a record of what we tried and where it went wrong." Thomas grinned. Sarah Morrison, long-term strategic thinker. "Who would have predicted that?" "I learned from watching my big brothers," Sarah said. "Both of you, actually." David's attention to detail and long-term planning, Thomas's willingness to experiment and adapt. It was perhaps the first time in their adult lives that any of the Morrison siblings had explicitly acknowledged learning something positive from the others. The afternoon flew by as they made final preparations for the community meeting. They practiced their presentation, anticipated difficult questions, and double-checked every calculation in their financing projections. As evening approached, David found himself experiencing a kind of nervousness he hadn't felt since his first major business presentation 30 years ago. But this was different from business nerves. This was personal in a way that surprised him. "What if they don't trust us?" he asked Sarah as they packed up their materials. Sarah looked at her older brother, seeing vulnerability that he rarely showed. "Then we'll figure out what it would take to earn their trust. And we'll do that. And if we can't earn it, then we'll have learned something important about the limitations of good intentions," Sarah said. "But David, I don't think that's going to happen." Thomas joined them as they prepared to leave. "Ready to go find out if the Morrison family can actually make a difference in the world?" David picked up his briefcase, then set it down again. "Actually, I'm going to leave this here." "Actually, your briefcase?" Susan asked, surprised. David never went to professional meetings without his briefcase. "This isn't that kind of meeting," David said. "We're not trying to close a deal or negotiate an agreement. We're trying to start a conversation." As they walked to the elevator together, Margaret's words echoed in all their minds. 6 months to prove they could work together. 3 weeks down. 21 weeks to go. But for the first time since this all began, none of them were counting down the days until they could return to their separate lives. The community center in East Oakland was nothing like the conference rooms where David usually conducted business. Folding chairs were arranged in a large circle. Children played in the corners while parents talked, and the smell of homemade food filled the air. Maria Santos greeted them at the door. She was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and eyes that suggested she had seen every possible variation of promises that developers made to communities. "Thank you for coming," she said, shaking hands with each of them. "People are curious, which is good. Curious is better than hopeful. Hope can be disappointed, but curiosity just wants answers." As they entered the main room, conversations quieted, and dozens of faces turned toward them. Sarah felt her social worker instincts kick in, reading the room for signs of hostility, skepticism, openness, or resignation. What she saw was a community that had learned to be cautious about outsiders bearing gifts, but that hadn't yet closed the door on possibility. "Let's begin," Maria said, and the Morrison family's real test was about to start. The next 2 hours challenged everything the siblings thought they knew about presenting ideas and building consensus. Unlike the corporate boardrooms where David was accustomed to operating, this room was filled with people who interrupted, disagreed with each other, asked pointed questions about motivations and track records, and demanded specific details about implementation timelines. Thomas found himself fielding questions about construction techniques from a retired contractor who knew more about local building codes than Thomas had realized existed. Sarah discovered that several families had already researched shared equity housing models and had sophisticated opinions about governance structures. David was questioned extensively about financial projections by a mathematics teacher who caught an error in his calculations that could have caused significant problems later. But something unexpected happened during those 2 hours. Instead of feeling defensive or overwhelmed by the challenges, each Morrison sibling found themselves energized by the engagement. "Mrs. Morrison," said a woman named Carmen who worked as a nurse at the local hospital, "my question is not about money or construction. My question is about commitment. What happens when this gets difficult? When the city creates bureaucratic problems? When neighbors complain about construction noise? When families disagree about community rules?" Sarah looked at David and Thomas before answering. "Carmen, that's the most important question you could ask, and the honest answer is that we don't know yet. What we can tell you is that we're committed to figuring it out together. And we're committed to staying engaged, even when it's difficult." "How do we know that?" Carmen pressed. "How do we know you won't just walk away when the project stops being interesting?" David surprised himself by answering, "Because we can't walk away. Our mother has structured this foundation in a way that ties our financial security to the success of projects like this one. But more than that, we've discovered that we don't want to walk away." An older man named Roberto raised his hand. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. I've seen a lot of people come through here promising to help. The ones with the best intentions often do the most damage because they don't stay long enough to see the consequences of their actions." Thomas nodded. "Roberto, you're absolutely right to be suspicious. We would be suspicious too. The only thing we can offer you is transparency about what we're doing and why, ongoing accountability for the decisions we make, and a commitment to measuring success based on what the community needs, not what makes us feel good about ourselves." The questions continued, but gradually the tone shifted from skepticism to problem-solving. People began discussing the details of unit layouts, community governance structures, and maintenance responsibilities. "I have a proposal," Maria said as the evening was winding down. "We form a planning committee with equal representation from the community and from the foundation. Every major decision gets made jointly, with community members having veto power over any aspect of the project." Sarah looked at her brothers, seeing the same mixture of excitement and nervousness in their faces that she felt. "We accept that proposal," she said. As families began gathering their children and folding up chairs, Carmen approached David. "Mr. Morrison, can I ask you a personal question?" Of course. Why is this important to you?" "I believe that you're sincere. But I don't understand what motivated your family to do this." David was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer honestly. "My mother forced us to work together by threatening to give away our inheritance if we couldn't collaborate successfully. At first, I thought she was punishing us for being unable to get along. Now I think she was giving us the opportunity to discover what we were actually capable of when we stopped competing with each other and started building something together." Carmen smiled. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She is. And she would be very proud to see what happened here tonight. As the Morrison siblings drove home through the Oakland streets, they were quiet for several minutes, each processing what they had experienced. That was terrifying and exhilarating and completely different from what I expected, Thomas said finally. They're going to hold us accountable in ways we've never been held accountable before, Sarah added. David nodded. And that might be the best thing that's ever happened to our family. They had survived their first real test, but all three of them understood that the work was just beginning. They had 6 more months to prove that the Morrison family could do more than just make money. They had 6 more months to prove they could make a difference. Most importantly, they had 6 more months to discover whether they could trust each other enough to build something that would outlast all of them. The construction site buzzed with morning activity as Margaret Morrison walked carefully across the starry, uneven ground, her cane tapping against scattered pieces of lumber and concrete. It was a crisp October morning, exactly 6 months since she had challenged her children to transform their family legacy, and today was the day she would see what they had accomplished. The East Oakland housing project was scheduled to celebrate its groundbreaking ceremony in 2 hours, but Margaret had come early to see it through her own eyes first. Without the crowd of community members, city officials, and media representatives who would soon fill the space, Sarah spotted her mother first and hurried over, her work boots crunching on gravel. Over the past 6 months, Sarah had transformed from a social worker who occasionally attended family dinners into the project manager for the most ambitious affordable housing development in the city's recent history. Mother, you're early, Sarah said, offering her arm for support as they navigated around a pile of steel beams. I wanted to see it before it became a public event, Margaret replied, her eyes scanning the organized chaos of construction preparation. Tell me what I'm looking at, Sarah smiled, and Margaret noticed that her daughter looked tired but genuinely happy in a way she hadn't seen in years. You're looking at 48 units of permanently affordable housing, a community center with childcare facilities, a shared commercial kitchen for catering cooperatives, and a half-acre of community garden space. And the financing? Completely sustainable. The shared equity model means that families build wealth as property values increase. But the affordability restrictions prevent displacement. The community land trust structure ensures that the land will remain affordable in perpetuity. Margaret nodded approvingly, but her real interest was in what she couldn't see in the blueprints and financial projections. And your brothers? Sarah's smile widened. Come on, I'll show you. They walked toward a cluster of trailers that served as the on-site project offices. Through the window of the first trailer, Margaret could see David bent over a computer screen, talking animatedly with a young Latina woman who was pointing at something on the monitor. That's Elena Ramirez, Sarah explained. She's a recent graduate from UC Berkeley's urban planning program, and David hired her as the project's community liaison coordinator. She's bilingual, she grew up in East Oakland, and she's been teaching David about the neighborhood's history and cultural dynamics. Margaret watched her eldest son, who had spent 30 years making decisions in isolation, clearly deferring to Elena's expertise on something. David seems different. He is different. We all are. Stayed. They moved to the second trailer, where they could hear Thomas's voice before they could see him. He was speaking rapid Spanish with a group of construction workers, gesturing at architectural plans spread across a folding table. Thomas learned Spanish? Margaret asked, surprised. Conversational Spanish in 3 months, Sarah confirmed. He said he got tired of important conversations happening around him that he couldn't understand. Plus, he wanted to be able to explain the sustainable building techniques he brought back from Costa Rica. Through the window, they watched Thomas demonstrate something with his hands while the workers nodded and asked questions. Margaret had never seen her middle son engage with practical, hands-on problem-solving before. And the three of you? Margaret asked. How has working together actually gone? Sarah was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. It's been harder than any of us expected, and better than any of us hoped. They walked toward the third trailer, which housed the community planning office. We've had fights, Mother. Real fights about priorities and decision-making and resource allocation. David wanted to move faster than the community was ready for. Thomas wanted to incorporate design elements that were beautiful but impractical. I wanted to spend so much time on consensus building that we would never actually break ground. Margaret listened without commenting, hearing something in her daughter's voice that sounded like hard-won wisdom. But we learned to fight productively, Sarah continued. We learned to disagree about methods without questioning each other's motivations. And we learned that we actually need our different perspectives to make good decisions. They had reached the community trailer, where Margaret could see a large table surrounded by folding chairs. The walls were covered with flip chart paper showing timelines, budget breakdowns, and what appeared to be collaborative decision-making processes. Every Tuesday evening for 6 months, Sarah explained. Joint planning meetings with community representatives. We make no major decisions without community input, and the community has veto power over any aspect of the project. How has that worked in practice? Sarah laughed. It's messy and time-consuming and occasionally frustrating. It's also resulted in a much better project than any of us would have designed on our own. Margaret nodded, but she wasn't done asking questions. And personally, how have you three changed? Sarah considered this as they walked back toward the main construction area, where workers were setting up a platform for the groundbreaking ceremony. David discovered that he actually enjoys teaching and mentoring, especially when he's working with people who challenge his assumptions. He started a monthly workshop series for small business owners in the neighborhood, helping them navigate commercial loan applications and business planning. Margaret smiled. David had always been a natural teacher, but his competitive business environment had never given him opportunities to develop that talent. Thomas discovered that he has a gift for translating between different cultures and communities. He's become the unofficial liaison between the various contractors, community groups, and city agencies involved in the project. People trust him because he listens more than he talks. And you? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. I discovered that I was using my social work career to avoid dealing with my own family's wealth and influence, instead of figuring out how to use those resources responsibly. I spent years convinced that wanting nothing from the family made me more ethical, when actually it just made me irrelevant. They had reached the center of the construction site, where a ceremonial shovel decorated with ribbons awaited the official groundbreaking moment. Are you happy, Sarah? Margaret asked. Sarah looked around at the organized chaos of construction, the trailers full of people working toward a shared goal, the neighborhood children who had already started using the construction site as an adventure playground despite repeated safety warnings. I'm proud, Sarah said. For the first time in my life, I'm proud to be a Morrison. As if summoned by her words, David and Thomas appeared from their respective trailers, along with Elena and several other project team members. Mother, David said, approaching with a smile that Margaret hadn't seen on his face since he was a child. What do you think? What? Margaret looked at her 3 adult children, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in decades. David still wore a suit, but he had rolled up his sleeves and there was construction dust on his shoes. Thomas had traded his artist's casual wardrobe for practical work clothes, but his eyes still held the curiosity and enthusiasm she remembered from his youth. Sarah stood between her brothers with an easy confidence that suggested she had finally found her place in the family dynamic. I think, Margaret said slowly, that you have exceeded every expectation I had. Thomas grinned. Even the impossible ones? Especially those. Elena approached the group carrying a clipboard. Mrs. Morrison, we're honored to have you here today. Maria Santos wanted me to make sure you knew that the Community Planning Committee has voted to name the development's main pathway Margaret Morrison Way. Margaret felt tears threaten, but she maintained her composure. That's very generous, but unnecessary. It was Maria's idea, Elena continued. She said that anyone who could get 3 siblings to work together this effectively deserved to have something named after them. David laughed. Maria doesn't know the half of what she accomplished. 6 months ago, the 3 of us could barely have a family dinner without an argument. What changed? Margaret asked, genuinely curious about their perspective on the transformation. Sarah and Thomas looked at David, who had become the unofficial spokesperson for their collaboration. We stopped trying to prove who was right, David said, and we started trying to figure out what would work. Thomas nodded. Plus, we had external accountability. When community members are depending on you to deliver on promises, family dysfunction becomes a luxury you can't afford. And we had a shared goal that was bigger than any of our individual ambitions, Sarah added. It's hard to stay petty when you're working on something that will affect dozens of families for generations. Margaret looked around at the construction site, but her mind was also reaching back to the decision she had made 6 months ago. She had been taking an enormous risk. Not just with the family's financial resources, but with her relationships with her children. "Do you forgive me?" she asked suddenly. The question surprised all 3 of her children. "For what?" Thomas asked. "For manipulating you. For forcing this choice on you without your consent. For risking your financial security to satisfy my own hopes about what this family could become," David answered first. "Mother, you gave us the greatest gift any parent can give adult children." "What's that?" "You gave us the opportunity to become people we could be proud of," David said. "And you gave us each other." Sarah reached out and took her mother's hand. "We should have been angry with you. We probably should still be angry with you. But this has been the best 6 months of my life." "Mine too," Thomas added. "And not because of the project, although that's been incredible, but because I finally understand what it means to be part of a family that actually works together instead of just sharing a last name." Margaret felt the tears she had been holding back begin to flow. "Your father would be so proud of all of you." "He would be proud of you too," Sarah said. This took incredible courage. The construction site was beginning to fill with people as the groundbreaking ceremony approached. Maria Santos arrived with several carloads of community members. City officials and media representatives appeared with cameras and notepads. Elena and the other project coordinators began directing people toward the platform where the ceremony would take place. But Margaret found herself reluctant to leave this quiet moment with her children. "What happens next?" she asked. "Next, we break ground on the most ambitious, affordable housing project in Oakland's recent history," David said. "We spend the next 18 months proving that community-controlled development can work at scale. And after that," Thomas grinned. "After that, we figure out which community wants to work with us next. We've already had inquiries from housing organizers in San Francisco, Sacramento, and Los Angeles." Margaret felt a fresh wave of pride mixed with amazement. "You're going to replicate this?" "We're going to try," Sarah said. "We've documented everything we've learned, and we've built relationships with policy organizations that want to advocate for the legal and financial structures that make this kind of development possible. Plus," Thomas added, "we've discovered that we actually like working together." Who would have predicted that? As they walked toward the ceremony platform, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a 78-year-old woman watching her family drift apart despite sharing enormous privilege and resources. Today, she was watching her children speak to a crowd about their shared commitment to affordable housing and community development. The ceremony itself was everything Margaret could have hoped for. Maria Santos spoke about the years of organizing that had led to this moment. Elena presented the community planning process that had shaped every aspect of the development. David explained the financial innovations that made the project sustainable. Thomas described the construction techniques that would make the buildings both environmentally responsible and culturally appropriate. Sarah outlined the governance structure that would keep the community in control of its own future. But what moved Margaret most was the moment when all 3 of her children stood together at the platform, and Thomas said, "We want to be clear that this project belongs to the community that will live here. Our role is to provide resources and technical support, but the success of this development will be measured by how well it serves the families who make it their home." After the ceremony, as people lingered to talk and children played in the dirt where the community garden would eventually grow, Margaret found herself in conversation with Carmen, the nurse who had questioned the Morrison family's commitment during their first community meeting. "Mrs. Morrison," Carmen said, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For doubting your family's intentions. Your children have exceeded every expectation anyone in this community had." Margaret smiled. "They exceeded my expectations too. But don't apologize for being skeptical. Your questions helped them understand what they needed to prove." Carmen nodded thoughtfully. "Will you be involved in the ongoing work?" Margaret looked across the construction site to where her 3 children were engaged in animated conversations with community members, contractors, and city officials. I think my job here is done. This is their work now. As the afternoon ended and people began to leave the construction site, Margaret gathered her children for one last private conversation. I have something to tell you, she said. When they had found a quiet corner away from the ongoing cleanup, all three looked at her expectantly. The foundation papers include a clause that none of you have seen yet. In 5 years, when the East Oakland project is complete and operational, you'll have the option to dissolve the foundation and return the assets to individual ownership. David stared at her. You're giving us an exit strategy? I'm giving you a choice, the same choice I should have given you 6 months ago. Margaret's voice was steady but emotional. If you want to go back to your separate lives and individual pursuits, you'll be able to do that with my blessing and full financial support. When? Sarah and Thomas exchanged a look, and Margaret could see them having an entire conversation without words. Mother, Thomas said finally, do you really think any of us would want to go back to the way things were before? David shook his head. I don't even remember what I thought was important 6 months ago. This work, this collaboration, this impact, it's what I want to be doing for the rest of my life. Sarah nodded in agreement. The Morrison Family Foundation isn't just what we do, it's who we are now. Margaret felt a profound sense of completion, as if something that had been broken in her family for decades had finally been repaired. Then I have one more surprise for you, she said, reaching into her purse for an envelope she had been carrying all day. She handed the envelope to Sarah, who opened it and read the contents before passing it to her brothers. What is it? Thomas asked as he read. It's the deed to Morrison Manor, Margaret said. I'm giving it to the foundation to use as a retreat and conference center for affordable housing organizers and community development practitioners. David looked up from the document. Mother, that's your home. No, Margaret said firmly. That's a house where I raised 3 children, who have now found their purpose in life. I'm moving to a small apartment near the construction site so I can watch this project grow. Sarah hugged her mother, and for the first time in years, it felt completely natural and unencumbered by old resentments or unspoken expectations. As the sun set over the East Oakland construction site, 4 generations of Morrison family values converged into a single moment of shared purpose. Margaret had given her children the challenge of a lifetime, and they had responded by becoming the people she had always hoped they could be. But more than that, they had chosen each other. They had chosen collaboration over competition, community impact over individual achievement, and shared commitment over separate success. The Morrison family legacy would continue, but it would be built on cooperation rather than competition, measured by community development rather than profit margins, and defined by what they could accomplish together rather than what any of them could achieve alone. 6 months after Margaret Morrison had challenged her children to transform their family, they had done something even more ambitious. They had transformed themselves,